Imagine you stand at Münster's gate in AD 1534 with a loaf of dark bread under one arm and a child's thin hand in the other. You hear a bucket of water slosh. You see a line of neighbors forming like a rope tightening around your throat. A man points at the bucket, then at your chest. Into the water, his eyes say. Be rebaptized as an adult, or step out of the city you were born in and into whatever waits beyond the walls. You feel the decision pressing against your ribs like a fist. Staying means surrendering the old life. Leaving means surrendering everything else. The Reformation does not drift through Münster like fog, it crashes like a battering ram. You see faces you trust, bakers, cloth sellers, men who once argued over pennies, now watching you like judges. You do not know who reports to whom. You only know the gate stands behind you like a last chance. A runner slams into the square, breath-tearing, boots splashed with mud. You hear fragments, counsel shifting, sermons sharpening, strangers arriving by the day. The strangers carry one message with the confidence of fire: adult baptism, a purified church, a new Jerusalem right here, right now. Not tomorrow, not someday. Here. You push through the crowd and feel bodies press back. Someone shouts scripture like it is a weapon. Someone else answers with a cheer that sounds too hungry. You see a church door thrown open. Inside, hands tear down images with the speed of theft. Statues topple, wood cracks, painted faces split. The old order does not fade, it is ripped out by the roots. You smell dust and old incense kicked up like a grave opening. A priest backs away, lips moving without sound, then disappears into a side street. Another priest stands frozen, eyes wide, as if waiting for someone to tell him which world he lives in. Nobody tells him. The crowd tells him instead, by stripping the altar bare. But the smashing is not the true test. The true test stands in the square, in plain water, in public. The line forms again. A hand grips your shoulder and turns you toward the bucket. You see the water's surface tremble from earlier bodies. You hear the words, confess, submit, be rebaptized. You feel every eye as if it is a knife tip. Outside the walls, another pressure builds. Scouts stagger in with news that tastes like iron. The Prince Bishop does not negotiate. He gathers men. Banners appear and vanish beyond the fields. One report says a small punitive force. Another says an army that grinds streets into flour. You cannot tell which rumor is truth, but the fear acts the same either way. So you step forward toward the water. Not because the mind becomes convinced. Because the body understands the math, outside the new rules means standing alone in a city that is learning to hunt dissent. The water hits your forehead cold and final. You hear the crowd exhale like a single animal. You feel hands shove you back into the mass, welcomed and watched at the same time. A voice near your ear whispers, now you belong. But belonging feels less like warmth and more like a collar snapping shut. The city reorganizes at sprint speed. You wake and the street has new rules. You blink and the marketplace has new owners. Property shifts toward communal control. What is yours becomes ours. Not through gentle persuasion, but through the kind of pressure that makes refusal look like confession. You see doors marked. You hear names whispered. You feel the air change when a family hesitates to hand over grain. But there is food in the communal store, therefore people swallow the new language. There is safety in the crowd, therefore the crowd becomes the judge. You watch a man protest, only a little, only with a frown, and suddenly he stands alone in the square as if a ring opens around him. The ring does not shout at first. It stares. Then someone yells selfish. Someone else yells traitor. The words land like stones. New leaders rise like blades from the crowd. A prophet's voice crackles through the streets. Jan Matthews, his words arrive like sparks that catch in dry straw. You see people run not toward bread but toward sermons. You hear the sermons promise cleansing, promise a city chosen, promise enemies exposed. The promises feel like a hand offering certainty in a time when certainty vanishes everywhere else. But certainty demands payment. The payment is obedience. Therefore, the city begins to measure souls like coins. You stand in a crowd and feel it. Approval becomes currency, doubt becomes debt. You learn to nod at the right moments. You learn which questions earn a smile and which earn silence. Silence becomes a warning. You receive work and watch duty. A hand presses a spear shaft into your palm, rough wood biting the skin. The weight surprises you, not heavy like a boulder, heavy like responsibility. You carry messages across streets where laughter grows rare. You stack stones for barricades until fingertips split. You drag timbers to reinforce gates that suddenly feel too thin. You listen to sermons that sound less like comfort and more like marching orders. You see Jan van Leyden step into the spotlight with theatrical certainty. His posture looks like authority even before authority officially crowns him. He speaks and the crowd leans forward, hungry for direction. He gives it in a voice that leaves no space for hesitation. You feel the old Münster slipping away, merchant city, guild city, replaced by something sharper, something that demands purity the way a blade demands sharpening. But outside the walls, the prince-bishop's ring tightens. Therefore, the siege becomes a second government. You hear distant cannon like doors slamming in the sky. You feel vibrations in the soles of your feet when a shot lands outside. You do not see the full enemy, only glimpses, helmets between trees, pikes in a field, smoke that rises and then vanishes. Fog of war swallows certainty whole. One day, a rumor says the besiegers starve too. Therefore, hope rises and people speak louder. The next day, a rumor says reinforcements arrive for the bishop. Therefore, voices drop and doors close earlier. Every rumor changes how you sleep. Some nights you jerk awake sure that footsteps sound wrong outside. Other nights you lie still and count heartbeats, wondering if the city's faith is a wall or a trap. Food becomes strategy. You feel it in the belly first, an emptiness that does not stop gnawing. Therefore, the city writes hunger into law. Rations shrink. Lines lengthen. The smell of cooking becomes torture because it is so thin. You watch a mother scrape a pot and still pretend it is enough. You chew bread that feels like dust and swallow anyway because swallowing means living one more hour. But hunger is not only physical. Hunger becomes moral. Therefore, the rules harden. Punishments sharpen. Fear becomes a tool held openly now, like a mace. Private doubt becomes a crime because doubt might crack the unity that keeps the bishop out. You hear whispers of executions, quick ones, public ones, ones that happen behind a door and leave a stain nobody names. You try not to look too long at the square when a sentence is carried out. But the square forces your eyes. You see bodies stiffen, knees buckle, faces go blink. You hear a prayer shouted over sobbing, and the shouting feels wrong, like drowning a person twice. The crowd reacts in ways that confuse you. Some look away. Some stare like they are memorizing. Some cheer because cheering proves loyalty. But if cheering proves loyalty, therefore silence becomes suspicious. You catch yourself practicing reactions. You feel shame flash hot, then you bury it because shame also looks like doubt. You learn to keep your face neutral until the crowd decides which emotion is safe. Then you copy it. A decree arrives that hits like a slap: forced marriages, polygamy, solutions announced as divine necessity. You hear it proclaimed as if it is mercy, as if it fixes imbalance and grief. But you see the fear behind doors, the bargaining, the coerced vows. You feel the city's private life pulled into the street and pinned there for inspection. But nobody dares say no plainly. Therefore, yes spreads not like faith, but like survival. A man accepts a new arrangement with eyes dead. A woman stares at the floor and nods because refusal is a sentence. Children watch and learn that holiness now means compliance. You stand watch at night with a spear and a stomach that cramps. The wood of the shaft feels damp. Your fingers numb, then sting. You see shadows move and cannot tell if it is a rat, a thief, or a spy. The city whispers that betrayal is everywhere. Therefore, everyone becomes an investigator of everyone. Sometimes the bishop's cannon fires and the impact makes plaster flake from a wall. You run to help pull stones away from a wounded man. You smell blood and lime dust. You hear someone moan like an animal caught in a trap. You feel your own hands slippery as you lift debris. The siege does not only threaten, it educates. It teaches that death can arrive without warning, therefore control feels comforting even when it is cruel. Jan Matthey's prophecies grow louder. The words sound like thunder in a locked room. He speaks of signs, of divine timing, of a moment when faith shatters siege lines like glass. But the walls still stand, the bishop still waits, therefore pressure builds inside Münster like steam in a sealed pot. Then the prophecy demands action that no wall can protect. A sortie. An attempt to break the siege with faith alone. You hear the call and feel cold spread through your gut. You do not know if it is courage or mass suicide disguised as obedience. You see men gather with weapons that look too small for what they face. You smell sweat, old leather, rust. Someone mutters a prayer and grips a pike, so tight the knuckles whiten. Someone else laughs too loud, a laugh that cracks. The gate creaks. Night air rushes in like a warning. But the city needs miracles now. Therefore, hesitation becomes treason. A hand grabs your arm and pulls you forward. You stumble, then steady. You step out with the group and the ground outside feels wrong, too open, too exposed. You hear distant metal clink from the bishop's camp. You cannot see how many enemies wait, only the dark, only the uncertainty. A shout slices the night. Arrows hiss. The first man goes down without a dramatic cry, just a grunt, a collapse, a twitch. You smell wet earth kicked up by running feet. You taste bile. You swing your weapon at a shape that might be a soldier or might be a panicked friend. Fog of war turns everyone into shadows. But shadows hide steel. Therefore, the sortie breaks apart into chaos. You hear screams that sound too close. You feel a jolt in your shoulder as something hits, maybe a club, maybe a shield edge. You stagger. You keep moving because stopping means dying under boots. You glimpse banners and cannot read them in the dark. You only know the bishop's men do not run out of bodies. You run back toward the gate and see it like salvation. But salvation becomes narrow. Therefore, men shove each other to get in. A friend's face flashes in front of you, eyes wide, then disappears under a surge of shoulders. You feel your ribs squeezed. You hear the gate groan under impact. Someone falls and the crowd steps on him because the crowd cannot stop. Inside Münster, the prophecy does not die quietly. It mutates. The failure becomes someone's fault. Therefore, the hunt for internal enemies sharpens. A man who once doubts in private now confesses in public because confession is the only currency that buys a few more days. The city's revolution needs enemies to survive, and it chooses them from the people next to you. Time compresses. Hunger deepens. You chew on things that do not feel like food. A strip of leather softens in boiling water, and you swallow it anyway. You smell broth that is mostly desperation. Therefore, bodies thin, tempers snap, mercy shrinks. You see Jan van Leiden's authority swell to fill the vacuum. He moves like a king because the city now calls him one. A crown becomes theater, but theater becomes power when people are starving. He speaks of divine right while guards enforce divine law with fists. You feel the city's pulse speed up, every day more intense, every day less human. But the bishop's ring does not loosen. Therefore, the city's inward turn becomes violent. Surveillance spreads like mold. A neighbor asks a question that sounds harmless, "Do you believe?" But the eyes behind it look like a trap. You answer carefully. You feel your own voice wobble and force it steady. You hate yourself for the performance, but performance keeps breath in the lungs. Now it is AD 1535. You are hungry long enough that thoughts feel slow, like wading through mud. You stand near a barricade and stare at your hands, amazed they still move. The city smells of smoke, sweat, and waste. A child cries somewhere and nobody hushes him because nobody has strength left for tenderness. Then the alarm erupts. Not a bell screams. You freeze for a heartbeat and the scream tells you everything. The enemy is inside. You do not get a clean answer. A gate. A betrayal. A missed watch. You only get the sound of boots where there should not be boots. You hear metal scrape stone. You hear orders shouted, overlapping, panicked. Therefore, your body moves before the mind understands. You grab whatever is near. A spear. The shaft feels slick from someone else's sweat. You push into a street and see silhouettes rushing toward you. A torch flares. For a blink you see faces, men with helmets, eyes hard, mouth set. Then the torch swings away, and they become shadows again. Street fighting is not heroic. It is choking smoke. It is cobble slick with something that is not rain. It is the metallic taste of panic like a coin held on the tongue. You thrust the spear and feel it catch, bone, wood, armor, impossible to tell. The spear is yanked. You lose it. Therefore, you grab a hammer from a fallen hand. You swing the hammer and feel the shock run up your arm. A man goes down. You do not know if he is enemy or neighbor until the torchlight hits his face, and it is someone from your street, wearing the same patched clothes. Your stomach lurches. But there is no time to mourn. Therefore, the body keeps moving while the mind screams. You see neighbors collapsing in doorways like dropped sacks. You smell burning that is not just wood, hair, cloth, flesh. You hear a woman shriek a name, and then the shriek cuts off. A door slams. A window shatters. The city becomes a maze of violence where every corner hides an ending. Orders come fast and contradict each other. Hold the street. Fall back to the square. Defend the leader. Defend the granary. Defend the church. You cannot defend everything. That is the point. But the mind still clings to purpose. Therefore you run toward the granary because hunger makes it sacred. You reach it and see the doors already splintered. A man kneels in spilled grain and scoops it into his mouth like a starving animal. A soldier's boot kicks him aside. Grain scatters across blood. You feel rage, but rage does not stop steel. You push back toward the square. The square is chaos, torches, shouting, bodies pressed tight. You see a leader's guard trying to form a wall of pikes, but the line buckles as people surge. Someone screams that the enemy is everywhere. Someone screams that the enemy is nowhere, that it is a lie to test faith. You do not know which scream is madness and which is truth. A blade flashes near your face. You jerk back and feel air slice your cheek. You taste blood and it shocks you awake. You slam the hammer into a shoulder and feel it give. The man falls. Another replaces him instantly because the night keeps producing attackers like the city itself births them. But exhaustion drags at your legs. Therefore survival becomes smaller and smaller. Not victory. Not righteousness. Just the next breath. By midnight, the streets choke with smoke. You stumble over something soft and realize it is a body. You see eyes open but unseeing. You whisper a prayer without sound because sound might draw a spear. You feel the city's promise, heaven on earth, turn into a throat closing. Somewhere, Jan van Leiden's presence is rumored. He holds a last stand, someone says. He flees, someone else says. Fog of war makes truth impossible. Therefore, the crowd invents truth that fits fear. You reach a threshold, one street corner, one doorway, one moment where choice becomes unavoidable. Fight for the theocracy that promises heaven. Or surrender to the besiegers who promise judgment. Either way, you step into someone else's story. You see a group of Münster defenders rally near a church wall. Their faces are gaunt, eyes bright with desperation. They shout scripture and charge because scripture is the last fuel. You feel the pull to join because standing alone invites death. But you also see bishops, soldiers dragging prisoners into the square, binding hands, shouting commands. Surrender looks like breath continuing, but also like chains. But chains might mean life. Therefore, the body hesitates even when the soul protests. You raise your hands halfway, then stop, because a defender's gaze hits you like a spear. Traitor. Your hands drop. You back into an alley and press against a wall, shaking. You listen for footsteps that decide your fate. A soldier rushes past, not seeing you. Another follows, sees you, and lifts a weapon. You flinch. The weapon pauses, just a heartbeat. The soldier's eyes scan your face, searching for meaning. Enemy, civilian, fanatic, useful witness. The soldier spits a word you cannot catch, then yanks you forward by the collar. You are shoved into a cluster of captives. Rope bites wrists. You smell urine and fear. Someone sobs. Someone prays. Someone stares blankly as if the mind leaves to avoid the pain. The square fills with prisoners and corpses until it is hard to tell which is more numerous. Morning arrives without mercy. Authority changes hands like a torch in a stampede, burning whoever holds it. The bishop's men control the gates. Münster stream collapses into inventory. Who is guilty? Who is spared? Who is made into an example? Peace does not arrive gently. It arrives as accounting. You watch officials point at people, consult scraps of testimony, nod, and separate lives with a gesture. A man is pulled away and his wife clutches his sleeve until a soldier tears her fingers loose one by one. You hear her plead. The plea hits stone and falls dead. But after a revolution, the aftermath is never neutral. Therefore, the punishment becomes theater. The leaders are captured. You hear their names like curses: Jan van Leyden, Bernhard Rothman, others, now spoken with contempt, now stripped of invincibility. You see them not as legends, but as battered men under guard, faces bruised, posture forced upright for display. Interrogation follows. You do not sit in the chamber, but you hear enough: cries muffled by walls, footsteps pacing, a sudden silence that feels worse than sound. Rumors spill into the streets, confessions extracted, statements recanted, names given. Fog of war remains even in victory. Nobody fully knows what truth survives the instruments of punishment. But the bishop needs a message more than he needs truth. Therefore, the city receives a signature carved in iron. Cages are mounted high on St. Lambert's church tower. You stand in the street and look up until the neck aches. The cages hang like empty ribs against the sky. The iron is dark, unforgiving, crafted to outlast the bodies it holds. You feel smaller than the metal. You feel the weight of a warning pressing down from above. You see people gather and point. Some cross themselves. Some spit. Some stare with the numbness of survivors who cannot decide whether to mourn or to celebrate. The cages say, this is what happens when a city declares itself the final truth. But the real weapon is never only pikes or cannon. Therefore, the lesson cuts deeper than the siege. The real weapon is certainty, certainty that turns neighbors into suspects and laws into traps. You feel it now, standing beneath the iron. The revolution begins with a promise of purity, but it survives by demanding proofs. It starts by purifying churches, but it continues by purifying people. It claims heaven, but it manufactures hell on earth when fear becomes holy. The dust settles, and the cost becomes visible. Families fracture. Bodies fill pits. Homes are emptied or redistributed. The city's trade is broken like a snapped axle. Survivors carry invisible wounds, memories of forced vows, of neighbors dragged away, of hunger that teaches cruelty. Münster still stands a stone, but something inside it is permanently altered. But the story does not stay trapped in AD 1535. Therefore, it crawls forward into every era that feels cornered. You recognize the pattern because the pattern is human. Under pressure, a community trades nuance for purity. It trades debate for loyalty tests. It trades fear for necessary cruelty. You see how fast the movement shifts, from reform to revolution to surveillance to spectacle, until even the aftermath is engineered as propaganda. The cages do not only punish leaders, they instruct the living. They teach that power writes memory in metal. The cages are still there. Not because Münster is proud. Because Europe needs a memory it can point to and say, never again. But the impulse keeps returning whenever hunger grows, whenever panic rises, whenever certainty is offered as a cure for complexity. Now the legacy question hangs heavier than the iron. Imagine you stand again at the gate with the bucket waiting. You see neighbors watching. You feel the city's fear demanding a simple answer. The water is not only water, it is a test of belonging. So when the crowd demands proof, when loyalty becomes a ritual and doubt becomes a crime, what does survival cost, and what part of the soul refuses to pay?